Defending Israel with David Harris on JBS is made possible in part by a generous gift in memory of Eric and Mira J. Spector, the Paul and Lynn Late Family Foundation, To Life, to Love, Barbara and Bob Goodkind, the Patricia Worthen Ullman Foundation,
Hello JBS viewers, I'm David Harris, and this is Defending Israel. It's almost exactly 1 year since the dramatic, fateful events of October 7th, 2023. And it's time to take stock of what has been this past year, where we are today, and where we're headed. And that's what I'd like to do with you, our viewers, over the course of the next 30 minutes. I remember vividly, as I'm sure all of you do, that day. A day unlike any other day, certainly in my lifetime, and I suspect in many of your lifetimes as well. As has been said before, the single most tragic day for the Jewish people since the Shoah, since the Holocaust. I remember the stages through which I went through, beginning with disbelief. This couldn't be true. This couldn't be happening. Israel was the most well-protected nation on earth, extraordinarily aware of everything going on around each of its borders, including especially Hamas-ruled Gaza. So this must be a wrong report. But no, it wasn't. With each passing minute, the reports got even more gruesome, more tragic, more shocking. Then I went into a brief stage of what I would call non-clinical depression. Will this ever end? Can the Jewish people and the one Jewish majority state ever live in peace? For a day, for a week, for eternity? And then finally, the stage that has endured just about all of these last 12 months, determination. No, we're not going to let this happen on our watch. And my inspiration came above all from Israel and Israelis. Yes, Israel was caught off guard. Yes, Israel had, as they say, the wrong conceptia about what could and could not happen in Gaza, from Gaza, by Hamas. Okay, there will be commissions, there will be studies, eventually there will be appropriate changes, but in the meantime, a war was declared on Israel, and I use the word very advisedly, a war was declared on Israel. And no, this had nothing to do with what we see and hear on the college encampments and on the street protests from New York to London to Toronto. This has nothing to do with resistance. Resistance to whom and to what? No, this has nothing to do with liberation. Liberation from whom? And this has nothing to do with settler colonialism or any of those charged words. No. This was a war. This was a war declared by Hamas in order to inflict as much damage, genocidal damage, I would say, as humanly possible on Israel and everyone in the wake of those thousands of people who crossed the border. And because it was a war, we, Israel and its friends, had to respond as if it were a war. And let's dial back just for a moment, lest we forget. Gaza was freed in 2005 and given the first chance in its history ever, to govern itself. Ottoman Turkey had ruled Gaza for 400 years, 4 centuries. No one ever discussed independence or liberation for Gaza. Most recently, Egypt had ruled Gaza for nearly 20 years, and not only had there been no conversation about self-determination for Gaza, but Egypt imposed a harsh military rule on Gaza. Israel, yes, Israel, was the first country in history to give the people of Gaza their first chance for self-determination in 2005. And what happened? Well, what happened by now should be well known. Within 2 years, The Palestinian Authority was booted out of Gaza. Many of its leaders were killed in Gaza by Hamas operatives. Hamas took full control of the Gaza Strip, and for the last 17 years, since 2007, has been in sole control of the Gaza Strip. Israel had not a single presence, not a single soldier, not a single structure, not a single settler in Gaza since 2005. So who exactly is the liberation from, other than, I would argue, the need for liberation from Hamas itself? Occupation? Again, no Israelis since 2005. None whatsoever. Suffocation? Everyone seems to forget that Gaza has two borders, not one. Why Israel is expected as the target of Hamas genocide to at the very same time to continue to keep humanitarian assistance flowing, while Gazans under Hamas rule are trying to destroy Israel, is something quite new, I'd say, in military history. But what about Egypt? Egypt shares a border with Gaza. Egypt is a fellow Arab country, a fellow Muslim majority country, and yet no one talks about why Egypt has also shut the border. Well, it shut the border because Egypt is as afraid of Hamas and its ideology as Israel is. Because Hamas poses a threat to Egypt, just as its mothership, the Muslim Brotherhood, poses a threat to Egypt. So no, it's not about occupation. It's not about liberation. It's not about settler colonialism, because no one has aspirations on Gaza. The goal of Israel in 2005 was to give Gaza a chance to create a self-sustaining, moderate country that would live in peace and coexistence with Egypt and with Israel. And if in fact that could be attained with Israel, then perhaps there would be more opportunity to look to the West Bank and follow in the footsteps of the withdrawal from Gaza. But no, Gaza did not follow the model of Dubai or the model of Singapore. It followed the model of Syria or Somalia, if you will. And let's be clear again, because Hamas makes no secret about it, none whatsoever. The Hamas goal is not a peaceful settlement with Israel. It is not a two-state solution. The goal of Hamas is the eradication, the annihilation, the destruction of the state of Israel. So those who want to march around on the Jewish side talking about a two-state solution as if that's the impediment to coexistence with Hamas are being utterly naive and foolish, because that's not the goal. That's not what we're talking about here. And those who want to criticize the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as being the source of the war are also getting it totally wrong. I can't prove it, but I would submit that if Benny Gantz, Yair Lapid, Naftali Bennett, or any other Israeli political figure were in charge on October the 7th last year, the exact same thing would happen. Because Hamas does not give a darn about whether the prime minister is center-right, right, center, center-left, or left-wing. The issue is not the prime minister of Israel. The issue is Israel. And by the way, just as Al-Qaeda first tried to destroy the World Trade Center in 1993 when there was a Clinton administration, they failed, though 6 people were killed and many more were injured in 1993. Then came the Bush administration in 2001 and the second attempt. But Al-Qaeda didn't care if it was a center-left or center-right American government. The issue for Al-Qaeda was America. The issue for Hamas is Israel. So we need to be clear. This is a war. And I have to say my inspiration has come from the response in the days after October 7th to what happened in Israel, the unspeakable, barbaric, genocidal attacks, mutilations, murders, kidnappings that took place on that day, and that were conducted ecstatically gleefully by the Hamas side, as the evidence shows by their phone calls and their videos back to their families and friends in Gaza, talking about how many they killed and how they managed to do it. But then Israel, rebounding from this disaster, began to recover. And out went calls to some 300,000 Israeli reservists. We need you back in the IDF. And lo and behold, shortly thereafter, more than 350,000 Israelis showed up, though only 300,000 were called. They came from everywhere. They came from their holidays in South America, their holidays in South Asia, and some even in their early 90s found their uniforms and showed up to offer to help. And over the ensuing months, nearly a year, those Israelis, women and men, Jews, Druze, Christians, Muslims, people of many, many religious and other backgrounds began to respond. And I would argue that they have showed the world, the strength, the determination, the dignity, the ingenuity of Israel, of its will to survive. And I would also dare say, though some would obviously argue, that Israel has done everything humanly possible to minimize civilian casualties on the other side. Now, that's not a simple proposition. It's easier said from defense ministries and foreign ministries and United Nations podiums around the world than it is in reality. Why? Because as we should all know by now, Hamas weaponizes civilians. It begins with women and children. It understands Israel's moral compass, and it understands Israel's Achilles heel. Israel has no desire whatsoever to create any needless death anywhere in Gaza or now anywhere in Lebanon. But insofar as Hamas and its allies use civilians as human shields, it makes it all the more difficult. As one of my guests on this show said a few weeks ago, if you want to know where the tunnels of Hamas are likely to be, create a triangle between a mosque, a school, and a hospital. And within that triangle, you're very likely to find tunnels, arsenals, arms depots, or maybe throw in a UN UNRWA facility, or a residential building, or a children's nursery. And there too, you're likely to find the tunnels precisely where they know that if Israel attacks, the world will suggest that Israel is engaging in wanton destruction, and it will redound to the PR benefit of Hamas. And as we know, too many in the media and elsewhere have played into this very transparent Hamas game and trap. But nothing has deterred Israel from continuing its efforts, one, to completely dismantle Hamas and end its military strength, two, to try to rescue as many hostages as possible from the original 250 who were taken on October the 7th, and three, to try to ensure that whatever comes next in Gaza will not include Hamas, but ideally a different kind of governance which will point in the direction of living quietly with Israel on one border, yes, with Egypt on the other border. Those are not easy goals. They're not entirely synchronized goals either, but Israel has tried to pursue them. And I would suggest, just as military experts like Colonel Richard Kemp and John Spencer at West Point have said, that no country has conducted such a complicated urban war where civilians are being instrumentalized against Israel with as much effort to save lives and to avoid wanton destruction. The record is not perfect. We have to mourn every unintended civilian casualty, but the fact remains, and I must repeat, that if Hamas did not want a war, it should not have begun a war on October the 7th. You don't begin a war and then spend the rest of your time whining about the consequences. wars do have consequences. So I've been extraordinarily inspired by Israel's efforts, and most recently now in Lebanon, where once again Israel has shown what the world came to respect over so many years: daring, creativity, ingenuity, and amazing intelligence. And I would argue that Israel today is showing the Western world what spine looks like, what guts look like, while too many in the Western world are clinging to meaningless words like de-escalation and ceasefires, but without any conditionality, any serious conditionality, and proportionality and international humanitarian law. By the way, all terms that Hamas doesn't even begin to understand, much less respect. Israel has said to the world, no. This is a Churchillian moment. This is a moment like in World War II, where your enemy is so evil, so determined to perpetrate as much violence, aggression, occupation, and yes, genocide, that someone has to stand up to the enemy. And we wish in Israel that it weren't us alone. We wish we would see more determination by other Western nations. But unless and until that point comes, we will do it. We will do it because we have no choice. Because the lessons of World War II began with the fact that people for too long underestimated Hitler and his extremist ideology. People for too long believed that they could appease Hitler, they could satisfy Hitler, when in reality there was no way to negotiate with Hitler because he was out to create a 1,000-year reign. And so eventually other nations had to wake up, often at great cost, in order to join the fight against Hitler and Nazi ideology. Israel today, whether against Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, or the head of the snake, Iran, is showing the Western world, the democratic world, what determination and courage look like. And then we learned some other things in the last year. We learned, for example, who were the spineless, who were the people that turned on Israel, turned on the victim of this war, turned on the victim of a genocidal effort. We learned about countries. We learned about countries like Turkey and South Africa. Not that we didn't already know, but boy, did we really see them in this last year for what they are. Shameless, hypocritical, cynical, deceptive, trying to blame Israel, trying to make the world forget about October the 7th. We will not forget October the 7th. We will not forget what happened. We will not forget that 1,200 people were murdered in a single day, and in American proportional terms, that would be 42,000 people in a single day. Look how America responded on 9/11 when 3,000 people were killed. Look at how America responded on December 7th, 1941, when just under 3,000 people were killed. 42,000 in American terms. Kidnapped, 250 in American terms, roughly 8,000. Our country was totally paralyzed for more than 1 year when Iran took several dozen American hostages from the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and held them. So Turkey and South Africa, we should understand. Qatar has been exposed. Qatar, which has tried so cleverly to be everything to everyone, to be friends to everyone, to be on all sides of every issue, has now been revealed as the paymaster for the Muslim Brotherhood ideology, for giving housing to Hamas leaders in Doha, the capital of Qatar, for providing massive funds in Gaza itself. No, Qatar cannot play it both ways any longer. And now we also know, thanks to ISGAP, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, that Qatar is the single biggest foreign funder to American higher education. The question, Why? Why? Why is Qatar, a tiny country, the major funder of American higher education? And the US Congress has begun to take an interest, a serious interest, and they need to continue. And the US administration needs to take a more serious interest as well and ask these questions. And of course, to those who wanted to find a compromise with Iran itself, the head of the snake, who wanted to believe that one could negotiate with Iran and live peacefully with Iran, well, go back to the 2015 deal that the Obama administration signed with Iran, one of the worst deals in deal-making history. And those who wanted to believe in this mirage that one could work with so-called moderates in Iran, while at the same time Iran was hell-bent on getting weapons of mass destruction, while Iran was a major patron of Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis and others, while Iran was perpetrating terrorist attacks, and not just against Jews and Israelis, though that would be bad enough, but against others, including the United States and Europeans. And for too long, those other countries tried to look the other way or engage in wishful thinking. Maybe Israel's example of deterrence and courage and guts and spine and cojones, whether in Gaza or whether against Hezbollah in Lebanon, will finally help wake up people to the reality of how we have to deal with these Nazi-like forces that threaten everything, not just about Israel, but about liberal democratic values. And it's ironic, isn't it, that those encampments, those protests in American universities, Canadian universities, Australian universities, the streets of Paris and elsewhere, Paris and London, are all populated by people who see themselves as champions of progressive values. They are marching for the most regressive forces on earth in the name of progressivism. They're marching in favor of jihadist elements who want to eliminate the only liberal democratic state in the Middle East, Israel, and replace it with a caliphate, an Islamic caliphate ruled by Sharia law. They want to remove women's rights and replace it with misogyny, and LGBTQ rights and replace it with homophobia. This is what so-called progressives are advocating for? Have they lost their minds? Or did they never fully understand the situation to begin with, but are robotically following either the jihadist instigators, or the neo-Marxist instigators, or the anarchist instigators? Wake up, folks. You're marching against your own interests. Whether you like Israel or not, whether you fully understand Israel or not, you're marching against your own so-called progressive interests. And what about other countries? Countries like Spain, Norway, Ireland, countries that I visited often, and I'm sure many of you did as well, that in the last year, in the midst of a war declared on Israel, a war to eliminate Israel, these countries thought this was the perfect time to reach out to the other side, to give wind to the sails of Hamas, and to declare this is the perfect moment to pursue a two-state solution, when even the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank cannot enter into Hamas-ruled Gaza. Or how about in South America? Countries like Chile and Colombia and Bolivia that chose either to break diplomatic relations, I should add Brazil to that as well, to break diplomatic relations, to withdraw their ambassador, or in some other ways to punish Israel. This is nuts, folks. A country like China, which I had always learned as a young person, had never experienced anti-Semitism. India and China were the two countries that never experienced anti-Semitism, and yet now China, through its own political support for Iran and Hamas, through TikTok, through other means, is actively pushing anti-Semitism. And we have seen a surge in anti-Semitism. Now, of course, there are some who will still want to say, wait a second, David, I just don't like Israel. That has nothing to do with Jews. Well, when 90% or so of Jews around the world are Zionists who believe in the necessity of a Jewish majority state, when synagogues or Jews on the street are attacked for their presumed support for Israel, even if the attacks take place in Los Angeles or Miami or New York, no, you cannot so easily and conveniently separate anti-Zionism from anti-Semitism and get away with it. You cannot. It's clear, it ought to be abundantly, transparently clear that they're one and the same. And when people ask me in the course of this year, what do we do about anti-Semitism? We don't live in Israel, so we're not going to put on a uniform to fight. So what do we do? And my first answer is, study Semitism. If you want to fight anti-Semitism, by all means do so. But for our young people especially, what's most important is to understand who we are as Jews, why we're Jews, why we feel nourished and enriched and blessed to be Jews. And once we have that sense of identity and belonging, which includes centrally the relationship over thousands of years between the Jews and a specific piece of land. No, it's not Brooklyn, it's not Bobruisk, and it's not Bialystok, and it's not Benghazi. It's Israel. What we know today is Israel. We have a special connection. This is not a new story of so-called settler colonialism. This is not what the French and the British and the Belgians and the Dutch and the Italians and the Spanish and the Portuguese did when they went out and colonized other nations. This is about an organic, visceral, spiritual, metaphysical connection that spans well over 3,000 years between the Jewish people and a land. Zion, Zion, a land that's mentioned scores of times in the Hebrew Bible. Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, a city that's mentioned over 600 times in the Hebrew Bible. And if you read the Hebrew Psalms, they are replete with references to Jerusalem, to Zion. Psalm 137, Harry Truman's favorite psalm as President of the United States, by the rivers of Babylon, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. So this is not a new story, but we need to know our history. We need to embrace it. We need to stand tall and proud in defending it as people seek to take it away from us on the ground in the Middle East or through appropriation in universities and elsewhere. And we need to understand that some of the people we thought were our friends a year ago turn out not to be such good friends after all. Can we trust the New York Times any longer? Can we trust the BBC? How do we listen to National Public Radio reports? How do we read Associated Press reports? What respect can we give to the United Nations, which has never, not once, ever mentioned Hamas in a single resolution adopted, whether by the General Assembly, by the Human Rights Council, by the Third Committee, or any other body? What about women's groups that remain silent for way too long as women in Israel were being raped, gang raped, mutilated, kidnapped, and killed? What about children's groups supposed to defend all children, not selective children, who remain quiet as Israeli children, even fetuses, were being bestially murdered, destroyed in front of their families, or in the case of some children, kidnapped? Folks, this has been a very gut-wrenching year, an extraordinarily difficult year. But if we need inspiration, look to the people of Israel. Look to the IDF. Look to those who have stood tall and proud. Look to our friends like Richie Torres, like Douglas Murray, like Bill Maher, like Dalia Ziada, like Hussein Abdul Hussein, like Mithal Al-Alusi. Look to our many friends in the non-Jewish world who stood with us. Look to the Abraham Accords and the 6 countries that have maintained peace. Look to countries like the Czech Republic that have stood proudly even when alone. And the fact that more and more Jews themselves have woken up and realized We're all in this together, all of us. So as the new year 5785 begins, we look to a new year of greater sweetness, above all of greater peace for Israel, for the Jewish people, and for all of humanity. This is David Harris, defending Israel. Shana Tova u'mituka.
JBS is made possible by viewers like you. This high holiday season, as a thank you for your tax-deductible support of our programming, you can request a signed copy of David Harris's new book, On the Front Lines. Simply visit our website for details. We thank you for your kind support.